Hi, welcome to Pyrography Made Easy. I'm Brenda. In this episode, I am going to be doing a product review for the Customizer V3 that was sent to me by Coolio. I was also given a discount code of PyroBrenda that allows you to get 10% off of merchandise from their website. Now, I want to state that I am not affiliated with Coolio. I do not receive any compensation whatsoever if you choose to buy something. Before I get going with the product review, I want to explain a couple things about this video. First off, there is a chapter called Practical Applications. In that chapter are a number of different ways that I am using the engraver that I think I would do on a regular basis. There are also a number of other chapters that have applications that are more decorative in nature. These are items that I don't see myself doing a lot. With all of these things, I will briefly explain how to do them, but I'm not going to go into a lot of depth. This is a product review video, not a how-to video. That said, if there is something that you are interested in and would like more information on how I did it, then leave a comment and let me know. I can always make a tutorial for that item at a future date. Well, let's get started with the product review. Unboxing. The box isn't very big. It's 4 1/4 inches wide, 7 1/2 inches tall, and 7/8 of an inch wide. Despite the box being small, it is packed with goodies. There's a small baggie containing items, the user manual, 30 diamond-coated drill bits, the Customizer engraver with a USB charging port at the bottom, the USB power adapter, and the cap for the Customizer. The baggie contains the engraver bit, the hex key, and 2 Allen grub screws. Size. The Customizer weighs 2 ounces with the cap on, and 1.9 ounces without it. It's 5 3/4 inches long with the cap on, and 4 3/4 inches long to the end of the collet. My measuring tape did not work well for the circumference, so I used this piece of paper instead, and the tool measures 2 1/8 inches in circumference. The bits are very similar in length. They average 1 3/4 inches long, and they average 3 30 in diameter. The USB charging cord is 12 1/2 inches long. Equipping. It is a very simple process of inserting a bit into the Customizer. Then insert 1 Allen grub screw into the threaded insert. I found it easiest to use the hex key for this. Tighten the screw and the Customizer is ready for use. The collet is very snug the first few times inserting and removing bits. After that it got much easier. I have found that the Allen grub screw does not need to be completely removed to exchange bits. This is great because trying to find the screw after it drops on the floor is not fun. Noise. Level 3. Level 2. Level 1. Power and battery. The Customizer has an LED display that shows the power setting and the battery charge. When first powered up, it starts out at level 3. Press the orange button and you can work your way down to the lowest level of level 1. Here are the spec details for the Customizer. I've circled the RPM listing. When I first began testing the Customizer, I primarily used the engraver. I wrote down the start and finish time of each engraving session. On one battery charge, I got 180 minutes, or 3 hours. After recharging the Customizer, I repeated this process. But this time I primarily used the drill bits. Like before, I wrote down the start and finish time of each session. During this round of use, I got 111 minutes, so not quite 2 hours. For test 3, I got 126 minutes, so slightly over 2 hours. Here's my battery duration recap. Per the instruction manual, don't use a charger that exceeds 5 volts and 2 amps. I hooked up the customizer to my computer USB and set the timer to see how long it took to charge. My timer can only go up to 99 minutes and 59 seconds. At that point, it starts back over. My computer has USB 3 ports, so the output is 5 volts and 0.9 amps. To fully charge the customizer took 177 minutes. That's almost 3 hours. I did another charging test, but this time used the RAV Power portable charger. I used the 5 volt 2.1 amp output side of it. I expected this to go much quicker, but it didn't. The final time was 175 minutes, and that's still very close to 3 hours. I timed the charging on 3 different devices, and they were all within minutes of each other. Once the display is showing 1 bar of battery charge, turn off the customizer and charge it up because you have mere minutes of power left. Drill versus engraver. The engraving bit quickly removes burn marks from the wood, even really dark burn marks. Unless you are extremely careful, it also digs into the wood, creating deep embossed or engraved lines. And depending on the application, this may or may not be a desired effect. The diamond drill bits act more like sandpaper. When used with a light hand pressure, they slowly remove color. Here's the before and after picture. For my next comparison, I'm removing color from a small area. On the left side, I'm using a drill, and on the right, the engraver. It doesn't take long to see that the engraver removes a lot more color and in a much shorter amount of time. Here's the final comparison photo. Hand pressure. Using a light hand pressure produces thin, shallow lines. A heavy hand pressure digs deeply into the wood surface. Here's how the board looks. When I angle the board, you can see just how deep the marks are that were created with the heavy hand pressure. Cleaning. The diamond drill bits can get dirty when you use them to remove color. I've found that rubbing them gently over an ink pen eraser quickly cleans them up. Here's a before and after comparison photo. The engraver can also get pretty dirty, plus the slots can get caked up with the wood debris. To clean it, I rub it over the ink pen eraser. If the bit is really dirty, I use the end of the eraser. I cut the end off so it is rougher, and this helps get into the engraver's slots better. Here's the before and after photo. Practical applications. My first practical application is signing my name on a dark background. I begin by using a colored pencil to sign my name, then I carefully engrave over my signature using the engraving bit. I use a light hand pressure when I do this. Another practical application is adding small highlights. A good example of that is the reflected light on an eye. It's easy to add a highlight even to the dark pupil. Another example is adding pinpoint highlights to raindrops. In fact, you can quickly add highlights of any shape to numerous things. Another application, one that is similar to highlights, is creating distant stars and small moons or planets. You could even create a moonlit scene. My next practical application is creating white whiskers. Normally, I would use the tip of a sharp knife to scrape the whiskers into existence. The knife works, but it takes a bit of time. The customizer was much easier and faster to do. I will mention that I used a smaller engraver for this. This photo shows two engravers. The larger one on the left comes with the customizer. The smaller one on the right came from Todd's Dremel set. He had one whose shank was small enough to fit into the customizer. Here's how the whiskers looked once I was done engraving them. I drew in two whisker shapes with a colored pencil. Now I'm scraping over the lower one with the tip of a sharp knife. The upper one I used the engraver on. I wanted to see how they compare. And to me they are very similar. The engraver was just quicker. My fifth practical application is creating clouds. I began by drawing cloud shapes with a pencil. Then I used one of the diamond drill bits to remove color and create the clouds. I should have practiced a lot more because my clouds did not turn out very well. The blue arrow is pointing to a dark line running through my board. I'm using one of the diamond drill bits with a very fine point to gently remove some of the color from that line. Rotating the board allowed me to get at the line from a different angle, and that worked better. That looks much better. The line was very distracting. My last practical application is fixing mistakes. Currently, I'm removing some of the burn marks to fix the cast shadows on my raindrops. Next, I'm using one of the drill bits to remove a spot where the pen tip burned past the edge of the object. When fixing mistakes, it is important to use a very light hand pressure with the customizer. I am attempting to remove another burn mark with a drill bit, but this burn mark is much darker, and the drill bit isn't working well on it. So I switched to the engraver, and that quickly removed the burn mark. But again, make sure to use a light hand pressure. For my last fixing example, I'm using a drill bit to gently remove some overburn. Overburn happens when your pen tip is hot enough to char the wood adjacent to where you're wanting to burn. Metal stencil. For this experiment, I am using a brass stencil to see if the customizer can work like a router. I'm elevating the stencil with coins because I don't want the customizer to possibly ruin the stencil. I secured the stencil to the board using tape. Afterwards, I equipped an engraver and did my best to keep the customizer at 90 degrees to the board, or straight up and down. And then I tried to follow along the stencil lines. I like to think that my idea was good, but executing it wasn't easy to do. For one thing, I had a lot of problems keeping a constant hand pressure. Sometimes my hand pressure was too light and I had to go back over the line. Most of the time my hand pressure was too heavy, so the bit was digging deeply into the wood and trying to go in directions I didn't want it to go. I was constantly fighting this thing. I found this experiment very challenging to do. Here's how it looked once I was done. It's okay, but not awesome. I'm rubbing some pencil over the design in the hopes that it will make it easier to see. After I put a layer of pencil, then I rubbed over it with a blending stump to smooth out the pencil, and you can see the design a bit better, I think. And the nice thing with pencil, it erases right off the board as long as it's not a real dark layer. Leather. I have a piece of leather that has a stained square on it. In this square, I'm using a stencil to ink in a design. Before I removed the stencil, I checked to make sure I got all of the design inked in. I also inked in the design on the unstained leather below the square. Afterwards, I used the engraver to carve out the design. I will mention that it is super important to use a light hand pressure for this. At first, the engraving on the stained leather has wonderful contrast, but you will see that changes. Here's how they looked after I was done carving. Next, I applied stain to the bare leather. Even before the stain was dry, I could see that the engraving was darker. The next day, I applied Resolene sealant to the leather. Both of the engraved designs darkened up. And here's how they looked after the sealant was dry. The one on the left was stained and then carved, and the one on the right was carved and then stained. Colorful design. I used a stencil and penciled in a design onto the board. Then I used the engraving bit and carved out the design. I made sure the design was carved deeply into the wood. On the larger elements of the design, I found it helpful to first carve around the edges of the element. Then I carved out the center. I did my best to keep the carving at the same depth. After the carving was done, I burned darkly over the engraving. I used the flat of a shader as I worked. I burned right over the design. If the shader is smaller than the engraving, then I recommend burning around the design. This large shader I'm using is from the set that came with the Good Crafter burner. If your burner accepts unmounted wire tips, you can buy a set on Amazon that includes this pin tip. They're not very expensive. Some of the design elements got a little brown, so I'm recarving over them to remove the char marks. Here's how it looked after I was done. I'm using watercolors to add color to one of the engraved designs. I begin by flooding an element of the design with water, and then I dab in the watercolor. This actually works fairly well. The whole purpose of this experiment was to add color and see if the deep engraving would prevent the color from bleeding along the grain lines. That it didn't do. The color is seeping into some of the adjacent elements. I repeated the experiment, but this time I'm using alcohol inks. The color is more intense, but it also bleeds more. Or maybe it's a case where the bleeding is more noticeable. I'm not sure. Alcohol inks are not water soluble. Make sure you have some rubbing alcohol or something like that for cleanup. Here's how the design looked after everything dried. The one on the left was done with alcohol inks and the one on the right watercolor. The arrow is pointing to an area where the alcohol inks bled into the watercolor design. Fancy border. I stamped a fancy border design onto my piece of wood. I used very little ink and a pale color. Here's how it looked after I was done. Then I used the engraving bit and carved out the design. This is the same process I used in the last chapter, but I did discover something a little different. I discovered that the design turned out more uniform if I carved all of one design element first before moving on to another design element. This really helped ensure that everything looked very similar. Here's how the board looked after I was done. You can see there is some ink residue here and there. I rubbed over it using a vanish eraser. I had to rub a couple times, but it removed the majority of the ink. I used an ink pen eraser on the really stubborn ink areas. Here's the before and after. Use the shader of your choice and darkly burn over the design to reveal it. And here is how the board looked once I was done. You can fill the center of your board with artwork, or use it as a picture frame and decoupage or glue a photo onto the board. For those of you who can paint, paint something beautiful in the center. There are numerous things you can do. I chose to do a simple flower, and here's how it looked once I was done. Smoke. I burned the board to a very dark color. Then I used a colored pencil and drew an outline of some smoke. Once my sketch was in place, I used one of the diamond drill bits to start slowly removing color from the sketch. Now I will mention that I am using a reference photo. You just can't see it in the video. I started with the brighter areas on the smoke. The reason was that they gave shape to the smoke quicker. Then I would work on the more subtle, translucent areas of the smoke. I didn't keep track of how long this took me, but this is how it looked once I was done. White rose. I have 3 dark boards. Each one was created a different way. I'm placing a rose pattern onto each board. The back of each pattern has a light coating of Elmer's spray adhesive. Afterwards, I used the engraver bit and carved over the pattern lines. I did this on all 3 boards. Then I removed the pattern, and I discovered that I didn't engrave all of the lines deep enough, so I'm touching them up with the engraver. Here's how all of the boards looked once I was done. The middle board is defective. A piece of the plywood fell off when I was engraving over it. Next, I used a diamond drill bit and slowly removed color from each petal. This is the same process that I used with the smoke. Here's how the roses looked once I was done. I quit working on the middle rows because more pieces kept falling out. Miscellaneous. I mentioned before that Todd gave me some bits from his Dremel that fit the customizer. I discovered that the bits fit into an empty pin tip tube. Plus, I could fit the baggie that contained the spare Allen Grubb screw. I keep it in the baggie so I don't lose it. Also, the tube was big enough to fit the hex key. Pros and cons. Let's start with the pros. It's very lightweight, easy to use, extremely portable, can be very precise, has numerous practical and decorative applications, can create gradient highlights, and it can quickly remove really dark burn marks. The cons. It has a long charge time, 3 hours. It's noisy. It can quickly create deep gouges into the wood. It creates a fair amount of dust. Make sure to wear a dust mask. It's a bit expensive. I would prefer more engravers and fewer diamond drill bits. The final question to ask is whether or not I think you should buy a customizer. I personally really like the customizer. It is super easy to use, much easier than the bulky rotary tools like the Dremels, at least to me. That said, this is not something that I would use every day. Instead, it is an accessory that will make certain tasks easier to do, like creating white whiskers. Is that convenience worth the price of the customizer? I really can't answer that for you. You'll have to decide that one for yourself. Well, that is it for this product review. I hope you found the information helpful. I do have a written version of the review on my website, Pyrography Made Easy, and that website also has a lot of free tutorials that have corresponding patterns and reference photos. I will put a link to my website in the description below. Well, thank you so much for watching my video, and I will see you soon.